Well, hello again, good people. It's the Big Heavy, and as you may be able to tell from my lackluster attempt at a beard, just got back from a 1-week adventure where I rode the Great Allegheny Passage bicycle trail with my family. We spent about 6 or 7 days on the trail, which runs from Pittsburgh down to Cumberland, Maryland, and then continues along the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal towpath all the way down to Washington, D.C. So it's a great bike trail, essentially car-free the entire way, except for crossing a few roads here and there. It's pretty smooth gravel for the most part, and essentially a great resource and something certainly well worth checking out if you're on the East Coast. There's a bunch of videos out there about it. Maybe I'll do my own someday. But rather than talking about the trail today, I wanted to talk about whether you should stay in hotels / B&Bs / Airbnbs type situations versus camping when you go on your own bicycle tour. And I thought this Gap trip was a good example to use since I did it a couple years ago solo when I went from Pittsburgh all the way down to DC, stayed exclusively in tents except for my first night up in Pittsburgh, versus this recent trip with my family where we stayed exclusively in the whole combination from full service Westin style hotels in Pittsburgh to kind of lower end hotels, to Airbnbs, to a few traditional bed and breakfasts along the way. A lot of people ask as they plan their bicycle adventures, do I plan on camping primarily? Do I plan on staying in hotels or some of the other different paid lodging options? And there's not always a clear answer, so I wanted to give you some of the pros and cons of each, as well as how to figure out for your own adventures which option you should choose. I think a mistake some people make is to consider this being all about costs. Obviously there's a cost to staying in a hotel. People jokingly will call it credit card touring, where you're, essentially rather than bringing camping equipment, just bringing a piece of plastic and using that to pay for your stay along the way. But there's a lot more to consider than just the pure costs of staying in a hotel versus the, supposedly free cost of camping. I think people also tend to stick with what they know. So, if you're a camping oriented type person, you might just assume you're going to camp on your bike tour. If you're a hotel style person, you might kind of assume that hotels are the right way to go. But it should be dependent on a number of factors. Obviously, what you're familiar with should play a role into the option you pursue, but I'd also think about things like the route you're taking, what kind of options there are along the way. There's some bicycle trips that have a whole bunch of camping options versus others where hotels are a little bit easier logistically. And I'd also think through things like the weather, whether you're traveling with other people that may or may not have varying degrees of experience, or maybe young children or something like that, where camping may either be a huge bonus and kind of add to the fun element, or it might end up being a burden when you're the primary camp setup guru. So let's start with talking camping. And again, a couple years ago, I did a trip from Pittsburgh all the way down to DC, camped the whole way. And I think the best part about camping is it provides the ultimate in flexibility. At its best, you can essentially throw a tent down anywhere you can find a flat spot of ground. And there's some debate about what's called bandit camping, which is this idea of camping somewhere where potentially you're not supposed to, or you're camping in an unofficial campsite or something like that. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not your mom or dad. I'm not here to tell you what you should or shouldn't do. The only thing I would admonish you to do is wherever you camp, whether you're camping in a $100 a night super luxe RV oriented campsite, or you're in a ditch on the side of the road, leave the place a little bit better than you found it. I'm a big advocate of this whole leave no trace idea. That's not to say that I'm encouraging you to go camp somewhere where it's illegal. You should respect the rights of property owners and all that stuff, but that's a decision that you have to make. But there is this idea, if you have a tent on your bicycle, you're pedaling along, you get a little tired, or you see a nice spot of land to the side of the trail or something with a nice view. On some trails like the Gap or C&O, there's tons of campsites. And you can basically just say, hey, do I feel tired? Yes, let me throw down camp. And you can get up when you want. You can kind of come and go as you please. You can stop when you want. And you add this nice element of flexibility to your bicycle journey. In some ways, that kind of highlights the romanticism of traveling by bike. You're self-contained, you've got everything you need, you're beholden to no one, and you can kind of sleep wherever. You don't need any reservations or logistics unless you're camping at some sort of formalized campsite. So that can take some of the stress out of your travel planning and out of your travel execution. You're not forced to do 30 miles or 100 miles to get to that next hotel that you booked a long time ago. You kind of have this ability to set up camp and sleep wherever you need to. Generally speaking, camping also lets you get a little bit more exposure to the environment you're traveling in. A lot of people tend to enjoy bicycle travel since you're exposed to the sights and the sound and the land, and you're kind of out amidst the fresh air and the sights and smells. And camping kind of continues that aspect of traveling by bicycle. You're spending your whole day in the sun and the environment, and then you can spend your evening also in that same environment versus going from this great connected experience to the land to some sterile air-conditioned hotel type building at the end of the day. Camping kind of lets you continue that enjoyment of the outdoors. In a lot of cases, campsites may also be somewhere that's a little bit more interesting than a hotel. You may be able to get 2 or 3 feet from the edge of a river or a lake or some beautiful environment versus a hotel that's in a more urbanized area and isn't going to give you that direct waterfront experience or the quintessential babbling brook that you fall asleep to feeling like you're the only human being for 100 miles around. A lot of people will consider the financial aspect of camping, and there's this idea that camping is free, and I'm doing the infamous air quotes because COVID kind of made things a little bonkers. But generally speaking, camping, even if you have to pay for a site, is probably going to be cheaper than a hotel or B&B. And you also have this element of potentially saving some other costs. If you're in camp, you're probably cooking your own meals, you're probably cooking your own breakfast, and you don't have that additional cost of having to go and spend the time and the money to go and procure a meal at a restaurant. And despite some of the COVID madness, there are still free campsites out there. Things like the Gap and the C&O and the Natchez Trace have a whole abundance of bicycle-oriented free campsites. And if you're not on one of those trails, there is, again, that bandit option where you're camping somewhere where maybe it's not an official campsite, and again, you're making your own decisions as a free citizen of the world and an adult that's able to do so. So now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about kind of the benefits of hotels / bed and breakfast / Airbnb. And I'm kind of lumping those all together, and there are some nuances between them, and I'll try and touch on a few of those. But essentially what we're looking at is kind of paid, reservable indoor lodging versus being outside in a tent, hammock, or just kind of setting up on the bare ground. And perhaps the most obvious one, and the one that's most attractive to a lot of people who maybe aren't that into camping, is you're outside of the cold and wet. You're not potentially sleeping on hard or uneven ground. You've got the ability to have some climate control. And despite the fact that it may be nice and interesting to stay in the environment, if you're spending your whole day riding through a rainstorm, or you're in blistering heat, or you're in a really cold place, having those few hours at night in a warm, dry environment could be a nice benefit. There's also the fact that hoteling might present some easier logistics for you. So you may lose that ability to kind of stop wherever you please, and you may have to make some reservations and do some advanced planning, but you also don't have the challenges of having to set up camp. And if you're a solo traveler, maybe it takes you 10 minutes to set up a tent, but you throw rain in there, you throw wind in there, you throw in maybe traveling with family or inexperienced people, and it may be 20, 30, 90 minutes to get camp set up, similar amount of time to tear that down in the morning. Versus a hotel, you kind of roll into the front desk, you plop your credit card down, you get your key, and in the morning you just pack up and off you go. Hotels, and in particular bed and breakfast style places, may also provide you the benefit of giving you breakfast. So again, instead of having to roll out of your tent in the morning, fire up the stove, potentially it's cold and rainy or otherwise not too appealing to be outdoors, you walk downstairs, you got a nice plate of eggs and some pancakes and that sort of thing waiting for you. We experienced that quite a bit on our family adventure on the Great Allegheny Passage, in that we stayed in several bicycle traveler-oriented bed and breakfasts, and every morning we had a nice breakfast of eggs and pancakes and fruit. And it was kind of great to just sort of roll out of bed, have a cup of coffee down there waiting for you, and have a nice hot breakfast that wouldn't be something I would normally cook if I was camping. You're also quite obviously not schlepping around camping gear. Even if you're going fairly ultralight and you're really sensitive to weight, you're probably going to have at least 2 to 5 pounds of camping gear between your tent, some sort of ground pad, and some sort of sleeping bag or mattress or hammock or something like that. If you're not super focused on weight by the time you add in cooking gear, by the time you add in tents and all that stuff, you may be carrying an extra 8 or 10 pounds worth of gear. That may or may not be impactful depending on your route. If you're doing tons of climbing, 8 to 10 pounds is, that's not nothing to drag up hills. So you do cut back quite a bit of weight by staying in a hotel. Now you do potentially have more of a logistical burden with hotels. Generally, if you're on a busy area or an area where a lot of bicycle tourists are, you may have to book in advance. But that does provide a bit of insurance on the flip side. We planned out our family trip. We had everything booked in advance. We knew where we were going to stay. We knew we had a room available. There was no question of, hey, if we roll into this campsite, is it going to be crowded? Is it going to be closed? Is it going to be, flooded or have some sort of problem? So there is that assurance when you book hotels of, I know exactly where I'm going. I know how long it's going to take me to get there. And I know that I have a bed that's warm and dry at the end of the day. There also may be some ancillary benefits. Again, if you're doing something like the Gap, where it is kind of oriented towards bicycle tourists, some of these places may have facilities to clean up your bicycle. We stayed at a couple that had nice secure garages, so a good place to keep our bikes at night. One of the bed and breakfasts, called Yoder's Mountain House in Myersdale, Pennsylvania, had a nice garage to keep the bikes. They had a couple work stands in there. They had pumps, they had tools, they had bicycle cleaning stuff. So, if you were on just riding the Gap, or if you were on a multi-month, international tour and just happened to include the Gap, you had a great place where you could spend a couple hours in a dry space. You could do whatever bike maintenance you need. If you had any repairs you had to get done, you could take care of that. You could clean your chain, get your bike all set. And on the personal side, some of these places had washers and dryers, so you could do some laundry, you could get yourself cleaned up, and you'd not have to worry about sitting around waiting for a laundromat, or trying to clean your clothes in a stream or in some sort of bag contraption, which I've tried to do and never had much success with. Along those similar lines, there may also be some ancillary benefits in terms of nightlife. Occasionally, if you're on a tour, you want to get out and see some humanity. There may be other people, if you're in a bed and breakfast style environment, that are also out there cycling that you can chat with. Or generally, a hotel or bed and breakfast is probably going to be near some sort of civilization. So you can get out, have a night in the town, go out and have a few drinks if that's your thing, see some other locals and chat with some folks and get a little bit of social time, versus if you're on a solo journey and you're out in a campsite. Again, it may be a benefit or a drawback depending on where you are and what kind of person you are, but you're going to be sitting there alone, having some quiet time versus having that ability to go out and interact with other human beings. Cost-wise, and I say this to last intentionally when talking about hotels, because I think a lot of people instantly assume, hotel's expensive, camping cheap, I need to save money, so I'm going to go immediately towards the camping option. But don't forget to factor in some of the startup costs of camping. You're going to need to go out and buy equipment, you're going to need to learn how to use it, and it's a pretty large selection of equipment. You're going to need the basic tent, sleeping bag, ground pad. Presumably you're also going to need to cook some food, so you're getting into stoves and cook sets and little places to carry your spices and all that stuff. So if you're not a frequent bicycle camper, going out and investing in all that gear may exceed the cost of going and staying in pretty nice hotels for a weekly tour. If you're only going out and doing a 1 week adventure every year or so, that cost may not be worth it. So, looking on paper and saying, it's going to be $700 for me to spend 7 nights in a hotel, that may not be more than going out and having to buy, $200, $400, $800 worth of camping stuff to get started, and then every year having to replace a bit of it or upgrade it or something like that. So how do you decide which route you're going to go? So firstly, and probably most importantly, bicycle touring should be fun, and it should be fun for you as an individual. Because some jabroni on the internet or some talking face on YouTube says, the pure adventurers, camp, or they sleep under the stars or all that nonsense, doesn't mean that's what you have to do. You're out there riding a friggin' bicycle. You should have a smile on your face, you should be laughing, you should be experiencing that childlike joy that comes with sitting on 2 wheels and being out in the environment. So if you maximize your joy by doing that for 2 hours a day and then staying at the Ritz-Carlton at night and having a butler shine your cycling shoes, you do you. If that maximizes your joy and time on the bicycle, then absolutely that's the route you should go. Conversely, if you're somewhere and cycling through Afghanistan or the Middle East or through Africa or whatever, and everyone says you should stay in a hotel because it's dangerous or this or that, and you've got experience camping, camping is what brings you joy, then you do you, boo. If one or the other of those options brings you maximal enjoyment of your cycling trip, then go for that route. So outside of your own kind of personal bias towards one or the other, or what you're familiar with, or what's going to bring you the most joy, here's some other considerations. So if you're kind of new to bicycle touring and maybe new to camping at the same time, I would strongly encourage you, if you've got like the 1 week, adventure that we take each year and you've never camped before, I might consider skipping the camping on that type of trip. And the reason I say that is if you go out, if you go out for a weekend and you're camping, you have one bad night, maybe it's a pain in the butt to set up a tent, maybe you're not quite used to it, maybe you have a terrible night of sleep or whatever. You ride the next day, you kind of repeat the process, and then you go home. And yeah, you're kind of 2 nights in the hole, haven't had a good sleep, and maybe you're a little thrown off. You can recover from that. If you've got that 1 week, this is my only week to go on an adventure, you have those 2 janky nights and then you start kind of getting into your groove, you may not be able to recover from that. If you spend the rest of that 1 week that you've planned and saved and taken the time off for and all that stuff, and you're tired and miserable and all that sort of thing, that's going to kind of ruin that trip. Oddly, if you're going to go for more than a week, if you're going on the, 1 year or multi-year around the world adventure, you're going for multiple months or whatnot, and you've never camped in your life, I think you're fine doing it on that scale of a trip versus the 1 week, because you're out there for long enough, so you're going to refine your technique, you're going to get things perfected. You probably have time for a few rest days in there if you're going for multiple weeks. So the only place where I would consider, if you're new to camping, don't do it, would be on that, 4 to 7 day kind of trip. Shorter trip or longer trip, go for it. You'll kind of learn as you go. You'll refine your technique. And as long as you're close enough to civilization that you can tweak your gear, you can send stuff home, you can order new stuff as you kind of learn and evolve, then I think trying out camping for the first time in that type of environment, either that short weekend or that super long trip, is not a bad idea. Camping is kind of a skill unto itself, so I would also consider, if you had the time before and you can go and do some backyard camping, or you can go to a local, state or national park or something like that, either with or without your bike, bring your bicycle specific gear, kind of bring your bike specific camping setup and just experiment with camping. That's going to help you out quite a bit. That's going to let you refine your gear, tune things up, see how long it takes you to set up your tent, figure out how everything works, and potentially change gear in and out. So if you can, plan for that little experimental trip where you take out that cycling specific gear, maybe even ideally, even if it's only a couple miles down the road, throw all your stuff on your bike, ride around the block 6 times, and then go set up in your backyard and just get that full experience to kind of debug things a little bit before you try and camp on your big adventure. I'd also think through your route. I think certain routes may push you towards camping or push you towards hotels. And even something like the combined Gap and C&O, the Gap is really nicely structured towards staying in hotels. There's a trail town probably every 15 miles. There's probably more hotels and B&Bs along the Gap than there are free campsites. But then conversely, you go down the C&O, which, they're connected and ultimately a lot of people ride them as one long adventure. There's national park campsites every 5 to 10, 15 miles, but far fewer trail towns. And if you said, hey, I want to do the C&O and stay in a hotel every night, you're probably talking about riding off trail a little bit. You may have a couple or 3 mile detour that may or may not be a lot more hilly than the C&O to get to that hotel that you want to use each night. So your route may push you in one direction or another. And again, for something like the C&O, I'd almost recommend biasing towards camping, just because they have those campsites that are literally right on the trail and they're every 5 to 10 miles. So when I rode that, I had a lot of times where I'd kind of be in the groove, I'd pass a campsite. I think they generally, if I recall correctly, have signs that tell you how far the next one is down the road. So I'd look at that, I'd look at the site, and if it was nice, maybe I'd stop early if there was, some remnants of an old lock or something cool, if it had a nice view of the river, or if it was just generally serene, I'd maybe stop a little earlier and set up camp there. If I was in the riding groove and maybe the site looked kind of meh, I would continue on. And having that flexibility was really quite nice. I haven't rode the Natchez Trace, that's kind of on my list, but that's another example where they do have those bicycle-oriented campsites right along the trail. And if you want to do something like a hotel or a B&B, you may have another 5 or 6 miles of detouring off the trace and going and getting to that trail town that has that hotel facility. I'd also factor in setup time and logistics. If you're traveling solo, it's generally not too bad to set up a small tent and kind of manage that. It's generally not too bad, depending on what you like to eat in the morning, to cook for one person. But in my case, when we went on the family trip, we had both the weather working against us. It was early April, so we had everything from 80 degrees to low 30s during our trip. Would have been even colder at night. To the fact that having 3 kids with us, they like to contribute and they like to help when we've gone on camping trips in the past. But ultimately, it'd be my wife and I, and primarily me, that would be in charge of setting up tents, getting sleeping bags out, getting ground pads, and all that stuff. And if you think of your own camp setup, if you've gone camping, it probably takes me 20-ish, 25 minutes to get set up. I now have to 4 or 5x that because I've got, now instead of 1 ground pad to inflate, I've got 5. I've got 5 sleeping bags to unpack instead of 1. We're going to have at least 2 tents to kind of squeeze in 5 people. So, you're doubling or tripling your setup time when you have a family. If you don't have a family, if you're traveling with someone who's inexperienced, factor in the fact that you may have to help that person with their setup. They may prove to be a super valuable resource, so you can kind of split the load of camp setup and maybe, one of you puts up a tent while the other cooks. Or they may be a bit more of a negative factor, at least in the beginning of your experience, where that person may just need to sit and kind of collect themselves while you have to set up the tent, set up both your ground pads, set up both your sleeping bags, and then you got to cook, and you've got an extra 90 minutes worth of work after having rode a bike all day. So that may or may not factor in your decision on camping versus hotels. Along the gear-related lines, some people really like to do a bicycle adventure and kind of be light and fast. They don't want a bike that's the stereotypical, tour pig, where you've got front and back racks, you got 4 bags on the thing, you got a tent strapped to the back, and you've got this, just overloaded bike with 50 pounds of junk hanging off of it. Some people even tour with like a carbon fiber racing bike, and they have 1 little tiny bag with a change of drawers and their credit card in there, and that's what brings them joy. And that may be what brings you joy ultimately. Don't think because you see people with these expedition bikes that are loaded down like pack mules that that's the only way to travel. And conversely, you may hate feeling cooped up inside of a hotel at night, and the cost of that extra weight on your bike doesn't really bother you. So, think of kind of your travel style in terms of light and fast versus flexible and having everything, including the kitchen sink, along with you. And finally, on the cost question, factor in the value of your time, factor in the value of your comfort, factor in also the value of flexibility. Again, depending on the route, camping may give you a ton more flexibility, or it may handicap you. If you're riding somewhere in more of an urban environment, you'll pass 50 hotels before you pass, 1 or 2 locations where maybe you can get permission to set up a tent in somebody's backyard or in a side field, or you may end up having to hide yourself in a ditch under a highway overpass or something that's frankly not that appealing a place to sleep at night. And finally, as you consider the financial costs of camping versus hotels, just make sure you factor in all the variables. If you're going to camp and you don't have the gear, you're probably going to need to go on a fairly intensive shopping spree. You're going to be in it for a couple or $300 worth of gear at a minimum, which maybe puts you in hotels for 3 or 4 nights. And if this is kind of your 1 trip of the year, the cost may effectively be a wash. Maybe you're someone that lives in a small apartment, and having a bunch of gear that sits around only gets used once a year is actually a cost that you don't want to undertake, despite the fact that it may save you a few $100 in hoteling. So with all these factors mapped out, again, make sure this all comes down to what makes you enjoy your adventure and have the most fun you can possibly have while on a bicycle. But hopefully some of those factors are things that maybe you hadn't quite thought of or hadn't considered, and help you make a better, more effective decision. In either case, whatever you do, whether you camp, whether you stay in hotels, whether you just ride through the night hopped up on some sort of stimulant so you don't have to sleep anywhere, which is probably not something I'd recommend. I think the absolute best advice I can give you at the end of the day, whether you're in a tent or a hotel, get out there on a bicycle, get out there on your own 2 feet, throw yourself in the vehicle that you have and get out into the world and explore a little bit. I can't think of any adventures, even ones where it's been rainy or gone absolutely not according to plan, where I've regretted getting out of my comfort zone and going on that adventure. So do it on 2 wheels, do it on 2 feet, whatever makes you happy, and happy adventuring to you. Big Heavy, wishing you safe travels in all your adventures. Peace.
Ever wonder why every talking head on YouTube asks you to hit the like and subscribe button at the end of their video? You are right, because we're living in a computer simulation. And our benevolent robotic overlords get just a little bit of energy every time you hit that like. So do me, the rest of civilization, and our benevolent robotic overlords a favor. Mash that subscribe, be kind to each other, keep living your simulated dreams.